Allegra Spender, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, David.
Now, you've been one of the few in Parliament trying to generate a broader debate about tax reform. Can I ask, to what end? What's the main problem that you think needs fixing?
I think there are two really big issues in our tax system at the moment. I think, and they're around equity across generations and within generations, and it's also about productivity. And tax is quite profound in its impact there. When you look at, let's start with fairness and generations. I agree that we have urgent issues now, but I think our tax system is playing into those, and it's actually young people who are facing already the implications of the intergenerational report. Young people are doing it harder, they're having a harder time, and our tax system is really driving into that. I had a young man in my office just the other week, and he said, look, I think I'm doing everything right. He said, I've gone to uni, I'm starting a job, but I don't see a path to me having secure, housing to be able to buy a house. And I think this is the challenge that we have now, and it's only going to be exacerbated into the future. Young people are feeling abandoned by the tax system, by the housing system, and I think the tax system has to play a part in addressing that.
So just sticking on that issue of the tax system, what sort of change is required?
Look, I think that what I'm trying to do is actually say, let's have some of that big conversation. And it is because I think you've outlined this morning, the major parties have wedged themselves so effectively on tax that no one can say anything. And so what I've done to date is I've got together people from the key economists like Ken Henry, like Ross Garnaut, leading businesses and business community groups, but also social sector, unions and those groups, and bringing them together and say, what are the challenges we see in the tax system and how can you play out? And an example of one where so far there's, I think, a really strong consensus is that stamp duty, for example. There's, I think, broad consensus across the community and across the sort of business and social sectors that stamp duty is a tax which really holds back home ownership for young people. New South Wales Treasury says that we would have 7% greater home ownership if we reform stamp duty and replace with a land tax.
Well, that's at a state level, but just sticking with the federal level, do you agree that income taxes need to be reduced and we either tax spending or assets more?
I think that the intergenerational report really highlights the problem with our reliance on income tax. So yes, I see there's a real challenge on our reliance on income tax. It's at a it's at a historical high, over 50% now. It'll get to 58%, I think, in the intergenerational report if we don't do anything, and that is on the basis of fewer and fewer working age people being in the population. So I think it's pretty clear. We can't keep on relying on workers. And Ken Henry was right. We're setting ourselves up for an intergenerational tragedy where young people have high HECS debts. They're going to have to pay for climate change. They're going to have to pay for extremely high costs of housing, and then we're going to rely on them more and more and more to carry everybody else.
So does that mean going back to these issues of taxing, the way we tax capital gains, investment properties, franking credits and so on, are those the sort of areas we need to look at?
Look, I think everything needs to be on the table, and I'm running a process because we're not having a conversation nationally enough about this, and the major parties are scared of it. And I'm running a process, and I think, I believe that everything should be on the table. GST should be on the table. Capital gains tax should be on the table. These are issues that we all have to face and say, well, what are the implications, both for sort of fairness, but also for productivity and making actually the economy run better? Because if we can drive productivity, we can also drive wages and our ability to spend on the things that really matter to us.
You represent, of course, the wealthiest, if not one of the wealthiest electorates in the country. What do your local constituents say when you suggest that all these things should be on the table, including capital gains tax and the way their assets are taxed?
Look, I think that, my community is more diverse than people think. You've got 60% of my community are in apartments, 45% are renters, so it's more mixed than you think. But I had a lot of older Australians who say, I just don't know how my kids are going to ever be able to afford a home or live near me. I think there's a real concern that the generations, that are coming up right now are not doing well enough. And so I think there are a lot of people, and I've had people just last week, people, in good careers with good levels of assets who said, look, it's not in my interest, but I actually believe we should look at these things because it's in the national interest. And I think, Australians and people in Wentworth are willing to have a broader view on what's in our national interest.
Well, to that end, let's go to a couple of things that are on the table right now. Which way are you going to vote on the government's superannuation tax change to increase the tax on the biggest super balances?
I'm going to have to wait to see what the legislation looks like. You know, the principle
You must have
of
an
saying,
idea. I mean, this has been debated
look,
for a long time.
Yeah, and I'd say the principle of saying, you know, adjusting the super system so it's really focused on saving for retirement is one that I support. But the idea of taxing unrealised capital gains, I think, is bad tax policy, to be honest. So I'm seeing where we go. I think if it was something that was much more just saying, look, you know, you're taxing, you know, increasing the tax rate of big balances, that's something I would support. It's the unrealised gains, which I think is really concerning to me, and that's what I want to see in the detail, how the government's going to do that.
Okay, but at the moment you wouldn't support taxing unrealised gains?
I need to see the detail on this one. I think, you know, I said I'm open to reducing concessions on super for, you know, very big balances, because we need to move to a system where it's more equitable between the generations. And I want to flag something on that. You know, why I think this is important is if you look at Grattan Institute did some great analysis that showed from 2004 to 2016, households headed by people over the age of 65 had about a 50% increase in wealth. Households headed by people under the age of 35 had pretty much no change in wealth. And I think that, you know, I take that to anyone in Parliament and challenge them. Is that the system we're setting up, that we want older Australians to, you know, to be accelerating compared to younger Australians? You know, don't we want the generations to be, you know, sharing prosperity together? And that's why I think this issue is actually really serious and right now.
Well, one of the other serious and right now proposals the government has on the table is the multinational tax reform. It's introduced legislation trying to stop multinationals profit shifting offshore.
Sure.
You moved an amendment which the government says would keep the loophole open. Even the coalition wouldn't back you on your amendment. Are you unwilling to crack down on multinational tax avoidance?
Not at all. My amendment was, the reason why I moved that amendment was because it hadn't been consulted. And, you know, I made that really clear in my speech. I think if you're going to get proper tax reform, you actually need to make sure everyone's in the room and discussing it properly.
Well, okay, the government, to be clear, says there's plenty of consultation through the department, through the process.
And I'd say that, you know, the Senate inquiry is now looking at this improper. And I said, that's what I said, just hold it up, take this part out and do the consultation on it properly, because that part of the legislation hadn't been in the draft, exposure bills. But, you know, the principle, absolutely. You know, we should make sure that Australian companies and Australian, you know, families are not disadvantaged by multinationals avoiding tax. 100% agree with the point, but it's just a matter of getting that detail right.
But it does sound like on both superannuation and multinationals, where the government is trying to make some change, you're yet to actually sign up.
No, not at all. I said on the multinational tax piece, you know, I think that they just need to consult on a part of that legislation, and it's pretty technical. And you know, it sounds, you know, it's a great line to say, oh, you're against multinational tax. Not at all. It was a technical issue, and I really, you know, I don't like that. But on the superannuation point, I said I'm up for it, but we just have to look at the detail of the legislation and make sure that's right. But to be honest, I think the government's missed a trick. You know, the government could have gone harder or broader on super and said, what are we doing to set up our super in a longer term way that is better for different generations? And I think they decided not to do that. I think that's the shame.
On industrial relations, the government's set to later this week reveal the latest tranche of its workplace relations reforms. We don't know all the details yet, but you know, part of this will go to trying to close a loophole where employers can pay labour hire workers less than a regular employee. Do you agree there's a case for change here, or do you have concerns?
Look, I think that there is a, you know, I accept that there is a case for change to look at our labour system, and I, you know, I think that's appropriate. But I think the question again, like I say, the devil's on the detail, because in industrial relations reform, you know, if you push it through really, really fast, which the government did before Christmas, you know, then you get what you got in before Christmas, which is 100 amendments, and still unintended consequences playing out right now. So I think that it is, you know, the principle I think is a reasonable principle. Let's make sure that it actually practically works, so you're not capturing, you know, businesses that aren't meant to be captured under that. But also, and I think this is a challenge I make to the government, is what are they doing in terms of making it easier to run businesses? Because they're making, I think, in some cases, appropriate changes to the industrial relations base. But at the same time, they do not have an agenda which is around trying to make it easier to run a business and actually easier to employ people. You know, I've been arguing with Tony Burke, the Industrial Relations Minister, you know, why don't you make the award system simpler? because the ABC, the RBA, and his own employment department has gotten into trouble for paying people wrongly, and that's because of the complexity of industrial relations system. And I think that's absolutely what the government needs to put on the agenda. Make it easy to run a business, because that drives productivity as well.
You wrote to Tony Burke on behalf of the crossbench, I think about 10 days ago, asking for longer consultation than we had in that first tranche before Christmas. Have you had a response from the Minister?
Look, we've had a verbal response saying that we will have greater time. So,
okay.
We'll see where that goes in terms of, how long that is. And I think business is also seeking that as well.
Right. And did he give you a time frame as to how long?
Not at this stage.
Okay, we'll see. Now, housing, you've mentioned that already as a real concern for renters in your electorate. Concern for renters everywhere. Just where do you stand on the ideas that the Greens have put forward of a rent freeze or rent cap? What do you think?
Look, I think the Greens have identified, absolutely rightly, that renters are doing it really tough right now. And frankly, renting has changed. We now have 50% of single parent families are in renting. But I think the problem that we have, with the Greens proposal, the problem I have with the Greens proposal is just they're not going to solve the problem. They sound good, like lots of housing policy in the past, but they're not going to solve the problem, because supply is critical to solving the problem of housing. And I commend the government what they're starting to do on supply. But I think that, if you had a rent freeze right now, what you would see is you'd see a bunch of people being pushed out of their homes because they can do it, a bunch of houses being sold, and, increasing dilapidated response. And then finally, what you'd see also is I think you would see, fewer and fewer houses being built because of uncertainty of the return. So I think we need to grow supply. I think we need to, but give renters more protections and help them have longer term rents. And then finally, I think we need to address things like the taxes on property, including something like stamp duty.
Just finally, Allegra Spender, I'd like to just ask you about how you and your fellow independents are travelling as we approach the midway point of this parliamentary term. There's a lot of buzz, of course, around the Teal success at the last election, but without that Morrison factor there's a question as to how well you'll go next time around. What is the strategy from here? What are the issues? What's the sort of pathway to staying in the seats that you've won?
I think the pathway is doing a really good job for the communities that you represent, because I think communities are sick of politics as usual, where it seems like the parties are fighting amongst themselves about who did this, who you can blame for that. And frankly, I've sat through so much question time where you go, you're just having an argument amongst yourselves.
You don't think anything's changed since the last parliament?
Look, I think it's better from what I hear, but it needs to be much better. Because I think the community says, come together, work constructively on what's important. And so that's why I'm dealing with tax, because I think that we absolutely need to make sure that we support, future generations. We need to give them voice, but we also need to make sure that we can deal with the difficult
that's
tax
interesting.
reform issues.
So tax is going to be a frontline issue for you in terms of the next election.
Absolutely, tax is going to be a frontline issue. But and I think because no one else is talking about tax reform, across the major parties right now, because they're too scared and it's too much wedging. But the IGR said this week, we have to deal with it. And frankly, if you talk to young people right now, they'll say we have to deal with it right now. And that's why I think it's really, really important.
And just strategically, are you and your fellow independents better off remaining independent of each other, working together as much as you do, or even coming together as a new moderate party?
I think what we're trying to do is actually work together and work across the parliament. To be honest, I've worked with the Labor Party, I've worked with the Coalition, I've worked with the Greens, a crossbench in the House and the Senate, and all those things make coming together actually is what you do in terms of being constructive. That's what you do in business, in real life.
But
that's what I try and do.
No talk of forming a party.
No, we're not. I'm here as representing Wentworth. That's what I said I was going to do, and that's what I'm going to do.
And you will go around next time. You'll seek re-election.
Yeah, look, I love the work. And, I think that this is a really important time. But I think it's a really important time to face the tough issues and not just, hide behind sort of basically the party politics, because a bunch of people in this country are saying, you don't represent me, you're not in there for the long term. You're more interested in your party and wedging the opposition or, wedging the government than you are in terms of dealing what's most important. And I think that's why people elected me.
Allegra Spender, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much, David.